Good morning, Rabbi. We are continuing on Masechet Berachot, and we are holding on Daf Mem Amud Aleph, 12 lines from the bottom of 41a. The limud of Amud Yomi for Chodesh Kislev has been sponsored by Shahab and Shenaz Rabbi for the health, happiness, and prosperity, and Aliyah B'Torav, their entire family, and Nachat from their children has also been sponsored by our own Aaron and Miriam Zaguri for Ilui Neshama of Itit but Miriam, that her Neshama should have an Aliyah. Amen. So we started discussing Rabbi Yitzchak's understanding of the famous pasuk describing the greatness of Eretz Yisrael, which reads Eretz Chitaus Ora Vegefen Ut Ena Verimon Eretz Zet Shemen Udvash. So what we learned was that this is coming, said Rabbi Yitzchak, this is coming to teach us the order of the brachot, the chashivut of the brachot, and the way we explained it was Eretz, which we're going to see it in the Gemara today, but this is the order of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the reason we wrote up to 5 and then 1 and 2 is what we're going to see very soon. So now the Gemara is going to bring an opposing opinion with this from Rab Hanan. Upeliga de Rabbi Hanan. And this Rabbi Yitzchak's understanding of the pasuk stands in direct contrast with what Rab Hanan explained on this pasuk. The Amar Rab Hanan, Kol pasuk kulo leshiurin. All of this pasuk is not praising Eretz Yisrael for physical fruits of Eretz Yisrael, but rather they're complicated topics being taught by every single word in this pasuk. Every single word of this pasuk, you learn a certain halacha from it, right? How so? So here we go. Nemar chita. First it says Eretz chita, right? The first one is the land of wheat. What do you learn? What halacha you learn from wheat? You learn shiurim of tum'ah. Now, what is the halacha? We learn ditnan. We learned in the Mishnayot, and this is brought in Masechet Chulin, Daf Ayin Aleph. Hanichnas lebet hamenuga. If you enter a house that has been inflicted with what we call leprosy, sarat. So if you go into a house that's tameh, everything that's there becomes tameh. Remember when you have a kohen going there, seeing that there is kenega nireli babayit, like it looks like maybe it's a nega. You go there and the kohen that sees that it perhaps is tameh, first he will command that they should empty all the vessels before he actually announces it as tameh, because everything that's in a bayit hamenuga becomes tameh. Well, there are exceptions, samit patil, but when you go as a person inside, you as a person become tameh. Now, how about your clothing? The clothing also become tameh, but there is a difference. So, hanichnas lebet hamenuga, if you enter this house, the kelav al ketefav, you're not wearing your jacket, you're holding it on your shoulder, right? So you're not wearing it the normal, you're holding it in your hands. Then says the Gemara, you become tameh immediately, right? If you're going in, kelav al ketefav, sandalav v'taba'atav beyadav, your shoes, you're holding your shoes in your hands, you're holding your rings in your hand, not wearing it on your hand, but holding it in your hand. Hu vehen tme'in miyad. Both you and them are tameh immediately. Hayal lavush kelav. But if you were wearing them, you're wearing your jacket, you're wearing your ring, you were wearing your shoes. Lavush kelav v'sandalav v'raglav v'tavotav be'ezbotav. Hu tameh miyad. He becomes tameh immediately. But here's the catch. Vehen tehorin. But the clothing are still not tameh until if you just pass through the house and went out the other door, it's not tameh. But if you stay in the house, right? Enough to eat a pras. What is a pras? Pras is half a loaf of bread, and it says patchitin. It has to be a bread made out of wheat, which is easier to eat it. Now, before we go through the rest of the Gemara of defining what you're eating exactly and how long it takes, you have to understand that the bichtah achilat pras, and if you take a look at it, the first wide line of Rashi explains it at the end. Achilat pras is chatzi kikar shiru chachamim et ha'eruv. This is half of a loaf of bread that Chazal measured for the shiur of eruv. Shu kulo mazon shte seudot. The entire loaf would be the food of 2 meals, and half of it is considered the food of 1 full meal. It's machloket Rashi and Tosafot if it's 3 kabetzas or 4 kabetzas, right? So that's something that it's not the time to discuss it right now, but so we will see like this. It's chita basically would give you kedei achilat pras. This is what we learn from it. Okay? That's the first thing we learn, the chita. Now, that's the way you eat it. The reason that it has to be pat chitim, a bread made out of wheat, is because bread out of wheat is softer, is easier to eat, is easier to digest, so it's eaten faster. And not only that, says the Gemara, it also has to be not pat seorin, pat chitin velo pat seorin, mesev v'ochel, you are reclining and eating it because that's faster, and beliftan, you're eating it with dipping it in, which also makes it a little bit more moist and it's easier and faster to eat. So that's so how much is this, by the way? The achilat pras is a range in the poskim. It's a range of somewhere between 3.5 to 9 minutes, right? That's just for halachic things of it. Says the Gemara, that's chita, that's the first one. So that's number 1, right? Number 2 is what? Seorah. Seorah ditnan, we learned in the Mishnah, etzem kesorah metameh b'magav masao v'ero metameh b'ohen. If you have a dead bone of a dead person, right? Then what's the halachot of the tumah? If even obviously, right? Obviously, if you touch a dead bone, you'll become tameh, right? You'll become tameh. But if you go under the same ceiling with a dead bone, do you become tameh? The halachot of tumat ha'ohed. If there is a corpse inside the room, you go inside the room, even if you are a mile away from the dead person's corpse, you become tameh, so long as you're under the same ceiling, right? This is something that I have spoken up. I take opportunity to speak about it. People should be aware of not buying plots of land, especially for Kohanim, in Batei Kvarot that are owned by Goyim, and they're not careful and sensitive to Jewish halakha and tradition. One of the basic things is, if you have trees that they are basically spreading their branches over graves and over the path, of course, no Kohen could be passing through that path. Many times they say, oh, well, we're going to keep away from the graves and so on and so forth, which again, by itself has complexities of halakha, but nevertheless, the esem kesorah, a bone that's small as a grain of barley, it already makes you tameh b'maga. This is obviously very interesting for the dental area, basically all the dentists and periodontists and oral surgeons and so on and so forth, that they have bone grafting and they have, bone to graft, basically. So is that considered asur? Is that, and many of them are kohanim, right? Is that considered as asur to touch the thing? And if it's bigger than a seorah, if the samples of the bone these are all, of course, processed processed bones that they took the things that not to react with the body and so on. Now they're starting, it's going to become bigger and bigger to have it synthetic bones for graft. That's that the tissues are not the same thing as the cadavers. They're not using cadavers for that. But the conventional bone graft, is that asur? Is that not asur? That's interesting halachic quandaries. But lemaseh esem kaseora, if you have small bone as shiur av a barley, that's asur to touch it. It becomes metameh. It's metameh. It makes you tameh if you touch it. But if you have it under the ceiling, that's fine. It's not metameh be'ohel. So that's the second thing you learn. Gefen k'deravit yain nazir. Right? And nazir is asur to eat not just wine, not just grapes, but any products of grapes or wine is asur for him. So you can't have the lulavot gefanim, the what do you call them? Huh? Yebra. So it's asur. The leaves are asur. The yebras are asur. Everything. The chartanim, the seeds, the grape seed is the grape seed. All everything is asur. Nothing from gefen you could have. So what's the shiur? So it's coming to teach you that if you have even other products of gefen in the amount of a revi'it of wine, then it's going to be chayav. This nazir that has made the neder not to have wine, when the pasuk says gefen, is coming to teach you a halacha for nazir, that the nazir cannot have a revi'it of gefen, right? That the shiur is revi'it. Now, you'll say revi'it should be the same for everything, right? No, revi'it of yayin is more. Now, it's machloked Rashi and Tosafot how to understand exactly the details of it, because the density is more, so the revi'it is going to be more. Without getting into too many details of this, assume that the revi'it of yayin, of wine, is a larger shiur than the revi'it of water. Now, we all understand that the density is more, but how that translates into revi'it being more, that's something that we could discuss, not for now. So that's the halacha that you learn from gefen, right? Now, the fourth one is what? Up there? Te'ena. Te'ena is very, very much related, because the Mishnah and the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, Daf Ayin Hey, Ayin Vav, they say all of the shiurin of Shabbat is kagerogeret. Gerogeret is a dried fig, right? A dried fig. Te'ena is a fig, and kagerogeret is the shiur of Hotzat Shabbat. How much do you have to carry and you will be hayav? An important shiur. What's the important shiur? Kagerogeret. And all the shiurim of Shabbat are basically that. Kagerogeret leotzat Shabbat. Now, rimon, what is rimon? The fifth one. What's rimon? The halacha is in Masechet Kelim, Mishnayot Masechet Kelim, when does a keli become no longer tameh, right? Now, you have a kli that became tameh. We have spoken before that if you break a kli, right, it's no longer tameh. You remember when we spoke about this much earlier on, we spoke about the machloket Tanaim in Masechet Baba Metziah, and Daf Nun Tet, really it is, known as Tanur Shel Achnai, the machloket between Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol and Rabbi Yeshua, which resulted to the sad story of Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol, Rabbi Eliezer Berachot being excommunicated and put in harem because he did not accept Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Gamliel, and other Chachamim's idea of what happens if you have a kli cheres, right? You have a kli cheres, a earthwork clay that became tameh. The Torah says you have to break it. Once you break it, it becomes tahor, because no longer a kli. How about if it became tameh, I broke it and then I reconstructed it, right? Like the mustaki that we were learning in Chol Shabbat. So does that become now tahor, or does it stay tahor, or does it go back to its state of tum'ah? Rabbi Eliezer wanted to say it stays tahor. They wanted to say if you put the rings, you cut it to exact rings, and then you reconstruct the rings together, it goes back to be tameh, and that was the machloket. But the core of it is if a kli breaks and it's no longer a kli, it loses its status of tumah, right? Now, different items that are made out of different materials have different halachot. So the Mishnah tells us there that a kli of a bala bayit, when you have a private kli, not a business owner, but a household vessel that you have, if it's made out of etz, kli etz, different materials of different shiurim, but a kli etz, a vessel made out of wood, the shiur is kemotzi rimon. If the hole is smaller than a conventional size of a rimon, of a pomegranate, is still tameh. Once the hole is large enough to pass through with a rimon, it's not a kli because you can't use it for anything, right? Why is it only for a household, a private vessel? Because in businesses, once it has a hole, you can't use it really. It's a it's a downgrade for the thing. It's degrading for the business to be using a vessel like that. So once it gets whole, you trash it, you toss it, you get something else. But the household, it used to be people would use things as much as it was still usable. So if it gets a little hole, right, that passes beans through it, you start using it for zetim, for olives that's a little bigger, so it doesn't fall. Once the hole becomes bigger, passes zetim, you'll use it for, larger items until you get to rimon. What's bigger than rimon? Rimon is pretty big, right? So then it's tahor, because this is no longer considered a kli that you could use, and it becomes tahor. But the shiur of it is for shiur of motzi rimon for tum'ah v'tahara, right? So that's the fifth one. Now, what's the sixth one? Says the Gemara. Let's first finish reading this inside. Rimon keditnan, we learned in Masechet Kelim, kol keli balabatim shiuran karimonim, eres zet shemen. When it says eres zet shemen, which is the sixth item on our list, Amar Rabbi Yossi, Berabbi Hanina, eres kol shiura kezetim. A land that all of its shiurim is kazayit, right? You want to say bracha achrona? What's the shiur? Kazayit. You have to eat kazayit, right? You're on a bench, kazayit. You want to wash for suda, kazayit. Everything is kazayit. You want to say, why everything? We just got finished saying 5 other shiurim over here. It says no, not all of it, but most of it. Eres shekol shiura kazetim, kol shiure asar kadatach. You think it's all of its shiurim? The Gemara says, v'hai ka'anach de'amaran. We just mentioned 5 other things that are not kazayit. Ela eres shenrov shiure kazetim. Right? A land that most of its shiurim is kazayit. Right? When you talk about measurements, what's the word that you use the most? Kazayit. Right? So that's easy. Zet shemen that the pasuk says would be shiur kazayit. I'm doing this way you can take a picture at the end, and during the day you'll review it a whole bunch of times. It'll sit in your mind. And dvash is easy. Dvash, we mentioned, doesn't mean honey. Means what? What's dvash mean? Right? Dvash means tamarim. And tamarim are the shiur of what? Kakotevet kasa. For Yom Kippur. That means on Yom Kippur, if you eat a little food, what happens? You're not chayav, but you did the isur d'oraita, right? Good, smart. Because the Gemara at the very end, last parak of Yuma, has a machloket between Resh Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan of what's called throughout Shas. This is something you have to know. Called Chatzi Shiurin. Chatzi Shiur, right? Now, let's start it backwards and come back to what Chatzi Shiur is. When do you become Chayav Karet Chas v'Shalom if you eat on Yom Kippur?
You eat more than the shiur.
When you eat kakotevet gasa, like a large date, which is much bigger than kazayit, that's when you become chayav. So you will ask, Rabbi, so if I eat half a kakotevet gasa, if I eat half of the date, would I be good to go? Right? And the answer is, yeah, you would be good to go to Gehinam, right? It's still asur deoraita, but that is a machloket in Masechet Yuma. Resh Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Resh Lakish says no. Chatzi shiur min haTorah is mutar. Only midarabanan is asur. In other words, from the Torah itself on Yom Kippur, you could take a chatzi tamara and eat it. Say, Baruch Hashem, right? Midarabanan is asur. Rabbi Yochanan says ma pitom. No. Chatzi shiur, half of the shiur is asur midoraita. And that's the halacha. We pass in like Rabbi Yochanan, as pretty much always.
Is it for the whole day or just for?
No, even one time.
So per city.
Every time that you eat even the smallest, minutest amount, it would be a isur deoraita that you transgress, but you're not chayav karet until you eat a kakotevet gasa within achilat pras. You see how everything is interconnected. That's why when you have a very ill person, you'll tell them, eat less than kakotevet gasa, every longer than achilat pras. Because every within achilat pras, and we use 9 minutes because that's the longest you're dealing with the deoraita on Yom Kippur, is every 10 minutes have a little piece of something for you not to get into a sakanat nefashot, the life-threatening situation, and that will be good to go, right? I'm not going to answer that question because it's complicated. Because after, after weight or after size and what size of what, popcorn versus density. So says the Gemara. So that's one. And says the Gemara. So we have all 7 of them right now. The Idach and Rabbi Yitzchak. So remember, this is who? All of this is, I'll put it like this. This is Rav Hanan, right? This for Berachot was who? Rabbi Yitzchak. So we have Rabbi Yitzchak and Rav Hanan that disagree how to read these psukim. Rabbi Yitzchak says, it's coming to teach you priorities in bracha. Rav Hanan says has nothing to do with priority in bracha. It's not teaching you this 7 halachot of shiurim, right? So how does Rabbi Yitzchak answer that question? Says the Gemara, ve'idach hani shiurim behedya miktivi. This shiurim, as it said, behedya, is it mentioned explicitly in the Chumash? It's not. It's not mentioned behedya in the Chumash. It's not mentioned explicitly in the Chumash. Ela midarabanan. It is all of this shiurim are midarabanan. Vekra asmachta be'alma. And this pasuk of eres chitaus ora vegefer u'tora verimon eres it's just the asmachta be'alma. It's just the backing for the derabanan. Now, this Gemara is a massive problem, which we're not going to explain. But I'm going to tell you what the problem is. The problem is the Gemara in Masechet Sukkah. The Gemara in Masechet Eruvin, right? In Eruvin, Daf Dalet, Sukkah, Daf Vav, the Gemara has the same thing and says, Shiurin, not al Derabanan, but Shiurin al Halacha Moshe Misinai. All of these halachot that we said, the Shiurim, are Halacha Moshe Misinai, not the Rabbanan. It's not a rabbinic institution, but rather they are halachot that Moshe Rabbeinu learned from Hashem directly in Sinai. They're not mentioned in the Torah, they're hinted in the Torah. How to reconcile the maskana of the Gemara in Eruvin, the maskana of the Gemara in Sukkah with what seems to be the maskana in Masechet Berachot Daf Mem Aleph Amud Bet, which seems to say is the Rabbanan, is a massive problem. It's a lot of Rishonim have spent a lot of time on this beyond the scope of our talk. But the Maaseh, generally speaking, we always say Shiurin, Chatzitzin, Umechisin, Halacha Moshe Misinai. We always assume that all the Shiurim are Halacha Moshe Misinai. That's the general assumption that you see everywhere. How to reconcile that with our Gemara that seems to say it's the Rabbanan for a different time. Says the Gemara. So Rab Chisda and Rab Hamnuna story. Rab Chisda and Rab Hamnuna havuyatu b'seudata. They were sitting at the seuda. Aitu lekamayhu tamri v'rimoni. They brought in front of them tamarim and rimonim, right? Which is dates and pomegranates. So before we read this story, well, dates are here, number 7. Rimon is number 5. So we would say, well, 5 and 7, we learned in first grade. 5 is before 7. So it should be Rimon first. You should say Bracha and Rimon, because that's number 5 in the Pasuk. So says the Gemara, Shakal Rav Hamnuna took one of the dates and said Bracha on it. Instead of taking the Rimon, instead of taking the pomegranate, he took the date and said the Bracha. Says the Gemara, Amar le Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda waited for him to swallow the first thing. Then he said, wait a second, what are you doing? Lo svira lemar, you don't hold lehat Amar Rav Yosef v'Itamar Rabbi Yitzchak. This that we just learned from Rabbi Yitzchak. Eres chita usara u'kefer u'tenav rimon. That kol hamukdam bepasuk. Anyone that has been mentioned first in that pasuk, kodem lebracha, is first in bracha, and we know how to count. Rimon is number 5. Tamarim dates are number 7. Amalei said, yes, correct. I hold of Rabbi Yitzchak, but there's something that you didn't pay attention to. And that is, Zeh Sheni la'aretz, v'zeh Hamishi la'aretz. That's why the Eretz is written over here nicely, right? Because that's the main word in the Pasuk. He says, there are 2 times that it says Eretz. It didn't have to say Eretz twice. He could have said Eretz chitaus v'gefen u'tenav v'rimon v'zeh shemen u'dvash. Why did it break it to say Eretz? Eretz is what makes them chashuv. Eretz is what makes them important. So the closer they are to Eretz, the more hashuv they are. So let's count. This is 5. This is 2. So even though that it's number 2 to the second time that Eretz is mentioned, but still 2 and 5, 2 wins. So Tmara and Rimon, which one comes first? And interestingly enough, we do this every year, don't we? Right? On Leil Rosh Hashanah, we do the Simanim. What's the first one that you do? Right? We do Tmara. And we say Yiratzon, and then we do Rimon, Meleim Mitzvot Karimon. That's much later. Right?
But there is a tie.
So the tie would be actually not really applicable. Good question. If it would be a tie, the first Eretz, of course, wins, right? So here would be, the tie would be like this, which is always Mezorot comes first. So there's no question, right?
You can dip your bread in olive.
It's good for memory. Says the Gemara, Amaleh said, wow, I didn't think about that. That's amazing. Amaleh, man yahivla nagari de parzala. I wish I had iron feet that I could come around with you everywhere and serve you and become your shamash. So that is where it ends. There's a beautiful piece of Rabbi Simcha V'Duinsk or Sameach that talks about why you have Zet Shemen separated from the other ones, and he says perhaps in Mitzrayim, this is like Rabbi Simcha or Sameach is a man that says actually has said some very interesting unconventional things, but he's sholet b'kol Torah kula. It's like all of the Torah, everything is on his fingertips. So it's like, but he says something is very interesting. Here he says that in Egypt, perhaps they didn't have zetim and temarim. And he tries to prove it because when the Jews complain about what they had free in Mitzrayim, they mention all of these, right? Gefen, tenav, rimon, but they don't mention these 2. And also in next week's parashiyot, when you see Yaakov sending to who they thought was the viceroy of Mitzrayim, to Yosef, when he wants to bribe him, he sends him things that they don't have in Mitzrayim, they have in Eretz Canaan, and he sends for them Dvash, he sends them Tmarim. So of course, that's something that he puts it together, but that's just a cute point which the Or Sameach mentions. Says the Gemara.
Is there any like a concept of Habib Adib within the main Shalosh?
That's a good question. Again, we have to come back to the concept of Chaviv versus we have not discussed it in a halachic term yet. So says the Gemara, Itmar, have you lifnehem to any Vanavi betoch haseuda? If they brought to any Vanavi, this is a new concept. Now we're going to start this concept. The previous concept in the Gemara was that if they brought in front of you two types that have two different brachot, you say bracha on both of them, right? You don't say bracha on one that's hadama and pater ha'etz with it. You say hadama and you say ha'etz. If there are two different types of brachot, you say bracha on both. Now, how about if they brought in front of you fruits in the middle of Su'udah? So you're eating Su'udat pat, and now they bring fruits in front of you. What do? Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna, if they brought Haviu lifnehem to enim v'anavim, they brought figs and grapes in front of you, betoch ha'seudah, while you're amidst the seudah, Amar Rav Huna te'unim bracha lifnehem. Rav Huna says you need to say bracha beforehand, ve'en te'unim bracha la'acharehem, and you don't need to say bracha afterwards. You need to say bracha beforehand because it's something that's coming to refresh, not part of the seudah itself. But at the same time, and te'unim bracha la'acharehem, because everything is patterned, is considered part and parcel of the seudah when it comes to Birkat HaMazon. Birkat HaMazon covers men shalosh. V'chen amar Rav Nachman, te'unim bracha lifnehem and te'unim bracha la'acharehem. Rav Nachman says the same thing, that he said bracha before, but there is no after bracha, there's no bracha achrona needed. Rav Sheshet Amar, he says, te'unim bracha ben lifnehem, ben la'acharehem. They need bracha before and afterwards. Why? Because, well, they're clearly not considered part of the Suda. They're coming to, open up your thing. It's not part of your Suda that's eaten with bread. So you say bracha beforehand. But you also say bracha afterwards. She'en lecha davar she'ta'un bracha lefanav, ve'en ta'un bracha la'acharav. That there's nothing that needs bracha beforehand in the Su'udah that you wouldn't say bracha afterwards. If it's part of the Su'udah, it's part of the Su'udah. And you don't need bracha even beforehand. If you already are telling me that it's not part of the Su'udah, and therefore you need to say bracha Rishona, the first bracha, even though that you're amidst the Su'udah of eating bread, you still need to say bracha Rishona, then you're telling me basically that this is not part of Su'udah. If it's not part of Su'udah, you have to say bracha achrona as well. It's not part of Suda. That's what he says, right? But there's one exception, says the Gemara. The only exception would be elapat haba'a bekisnin bilvad. Only pat haba'a bekisnin is something that's an exception to the rule, and you would need to say bracha in the beginning, but you wouldn't say bracha at the end. What is this pat haba'a bekisnin? Is a three-way machloket rishonim, which Bezrat Hashem we're going to explain in the days to come.